And welcome to all of you to Advent, which is quite hard to believe. We are already in that season of the year. I remember 25 years ago this week, I was serving in New York City, serving in a field education site in New York, and was preaching that week before Thanksgiving. And I was young and naive and thought I was so clever, and I thought my sermon was really good about going home. How wonderful it is to go home. We've seen all these commercials this week, right? I vividly recall a young woman making her way through the reception line after the service and who said, "Tim, I hope for the rest of your ministry you know that it's not easy for some to go home. This is a very difficult week for me and for others to go home." I've never forgotten her face. I can't remember her name. I've never forgotten her face. And I remember those words this time every year and as we move into Christmas. It was not easy for me to go home this past week. Thank you to those who sent me text or note cards or emails or called. I appreciate being reminded that I have a family here. I do appreciate those thank you notes. Going home for my stepfather's funeral, to best say, was complicated, is complicated. He and I did not have a very good relationship, nor did my siblings have a good relationship with him. So it was complicated, tough. And if my words this morning don't make any sense, they may not, because I'm still in the midst of a soul swirl, trying to make sense of it all. Jesus once said that it's difficult for a prophet to go back to your hometown. If we drop the word prophet and use the modern word preacher, it's difficult for a preacher to go home because you return to a place where people knew you once upon a time, and they knew you a little differently. And so you go back a bit differently. And that was the case this past week. The funeral was at a Baptist church in Jackson. It was difficult for me to go back to a funeral service in a Baptist church. And I can say that because I was a Baptist once upon a time. So I'm not pointing fingers or belittling the service. But I found it difficult when the minister basically offered an altar call at the end of the message, basically an invitation for people to get saved. I personally have difficulty with doing that at a funeral in a very difficult emotional moment for so many people, to then use that opportunity to talk about heaven and hell and where you're going to spend eternity. That I find to be very difficult, if not inappropriate. That's me. Going home is complicated for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who live in Jerusalem and call Jerusalem their home, and they have for thousands of years. And as all of you know all too well, Jerusalem is a place that has never been at peace with itself. Contrary to what the psalmist prays for this morning, there has never been a great deal of unity in Jerusalem. I was reminded of that this past week while reading, knowing I was going to have to preach today, reading this song, thinking about the complications of where you call home. Some homes that don't have peace. Also knowing that this coming Tuesday, I lead a group of nearly 30 people on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem has been on my mind a lot lately. Home has been on my mind a lot. We are to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, is what the psalmist prays for and asks us to pray for. And beyond praying for the peace of Jerusalem, one way that I can help create peace in Jerusalem is by taking some of you and introducing you for the very first time. A city that has been much maligned and mainly misunderstood. That's a small way of helping create peace, is to introduce some of you, for you to see it firsthand and get to know some of the Jewish and Palestinian folks who live in that area and try to live together. The writer of Luke said that Jesus at one point in his ministry turned his face toward Jerusalem and everything changed. In that moment, Jesus set his face to Jerusalem, and that would become his home. He left Nazareth, and he went to Jerusalem, knowing full well what was soon to come. I was in my home this past week, the home where I was born and raised, a very complicated one. And this week, I go to my real home, Jerusalem. Another wonderful, complicated, joyous place. I'm going home this week. I'm going to Jerusalem. I mentioned that I had some discomfort in the funeral this past week when the minister offered the altar call for people to get saved. I'm about to do something similar. In a few moments, you will be invited to come to this altar rail, to make your way to this altar. You are making your way to Jerusalem by coming to this altar rail, by taking the bread and wine, redoing what Jesus did with his friends. You are going to Jerusalem just as Jesus did 2,000 years ago. These wonderful words from the opening hymn. We follow all and heed your call to come into the banquet hall. You're invited to a banquet this morning, prepared for you 2,000 years ago. I invite you to come home. In the name of God, amen.